Welcome to our Technology in the Spotlight session, Information Governance Considerations in a Social, Mobile, and Cloud-Based World. At the end of the show, we are happy to take questions and answers via Twitter. Please tweet your questions to #ARMA12. And now, please welcome to the stage your moderator for the event, Forrester Principal Analyst, Brian Hill.
Good morning. It's great to be here in Chicago. Fantastic session. Really looking forward to it. Also been very fortunate to work with ARMA International for several years. Very much appreciate the partnership. Also very much looking forward to a fantastic conversation here. So social media, cloud computing, and mobile devices are critical trends, and it's very important that records managers focus on this appropriately. And to foster this conversation, we've got a fantastic team of panelists. So panelists, if you could please start coming out. We have Galina Detskuetsky with Autonomy, an HP company. Galina is a senior VP with Autonomy. I've known Galina for years, and she's an international expert in records management. She chairs the board of ARMA International and founded MDY, a records management firm.
Hello, Brian.
Hey, Galina. We also have Bassam Sarkut. Bassam is RSD's Chief Technology Officer. He has over 16 years of experience with records and content management, archiving, and imaging. Bassam has helped companies around the globe define and implement corporate file classifications and retention schedules. As a frequent speaker at ARMA and other industry groups. We also have Tom Redding. Tom is a principal with EMC's information governance practice and helps EMC's customers solve challenges with regulatory compliance, litigation support, and privacy issues. Tom is a longtime member of ARMA and has decades of experiences in guiding enterprises with appropriate regulatory compliance and litigation support. And last but not least, we have Amir Jabalji. Amir is a VP of Product Management with StoredIQ. So in this role, he manages the creation and development of the company's product roadmap and spearheads the firm's DataIQ and RecordsIQ offerings. Prior to joining StoredIQ, Amir served as Director of Product Management and Senior Technical Consultant for MessageOne, which was recently acquired by Dell. So. Thank you all, and definitely looking forward to a very interactive conversation. So, Galina, I'd like to start out with you. So we bat about a lot of different terminology here, and certainly enterprise adoption of cloud-based applications continues to surge. Last week, I had the opportunity to attend Salesforce, and it's really remarkable how enterprise adoption of cloud-based applications like Salesforce has continued to surge. But I think it's also important for records managers to understand when they start to hear, we're moving to the cloud. What does that really mean? So I guess to start us out, it would be really helpful to get some common definitions and just to make sure that we're using similar concepts. So Galina, do you want to start out?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Brian. So thanks for having us here. It's certainly a pleasure, always, to have this conversation. And you're exactly right. When people say, I am in the cloud or I'm going to the cloud, that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. In fact, by show of hands, how many of you think you have something running in the cloud in your enterprise? Well, probably those of you who didn't raise their hands do anyway, but you just don't know you do. So cloud could be all kinds of different things. So for example, I could actually archive my data to the cloud, meaning I could actually stream my data out, let's say email and so forth. I could run applications that are offered as services in the cloud. So you mentioned Salesforce. That's a great example. I might subscribe to Salesforce. I'll put all my leads out there. They'll sit in the cloud. But I'm subscribing to that particular software, so I'm no longer upgrading. So I could have software on-premise and stream. I could have subscription. By the way, those of you using Gmail or Facebook, you're in the cloud. So cloud, again, comes in those varieties where you're subscribing to the application. So various flavors there. Also, you could buy infrastructure in the cloud, for example. You do not have the hardware to run particular applications. So you're an application provider, like Salesforce or a smaller company, and you don't want to have the infrastructure, so you buy that from a cloud provider. So there's infrastructure in the cloud. And oh, by the way, I could be an application provider in the cloud buying infrastructure from somebody else, selling you the application, so where's your data? That's actually an interesting question to ponder. Who's responsible for your data is another one. So again, taking these different kinds of flavors, and if I may for another second, there's also different terms that you hear, such as public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid cloud, whereas a private cloud would be something that's dedicated just to you, dedicated pipe, et cetera, and security. And again, hosted versus cloud, that's another distinction you have to think about, whereas a hosted application might not necessarily be really the same as a cloud application that's multi-tenanted, private or otherwise. So private, dedicated to you, dedicated pipe, dedicated security. A lot of big enterprises, government, for example, will do that. You could have a public cloud, Facebook, Gmail, totally public cloud. You're not going to tell Gmail that you want a private pipe, unless you're really big, and then of course you could. And so that kind of thing. And then there's hybrid, where you have a dedicated look and feel, but you're subscribing to a public site. So, but you've got your security and constraints and so forth. So various kinds of things to think about, right, as you think about cloud for your enterprise. Good, bad, or indifferent, they're all either. You just have to think about what your enterprise needs.
Great. Thank you for a very comprehensive overview. I think it's important to level set as we're getting into this conversation, especially since these terms are bandied about, sometimes with occasionally conflicting definitions. So there are a lot of reasons why companies go to the cloud, and one of those reasons has to do with capturing lower total cost of ownership, specifically around storage savings. So, but it's also very important to make sure that as you're thinking about a migration from an existing on-premises application to a cloud-based application, that you go about it in the right way. So, Amra, I'd like to turn to you. What recommendations would you have for the folks here in the audience about not just moving digital landfills that might be on-premises to the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that you need to be concerned about is that you're not moving the problems that you have today behind the firewall to just moving them to a new place. And I like to, I guess, use a metaphor of it's like when you're moving a house, right? When you move from one house to another, everybody always recommends that you go through your stuff and throw as much away as possible and clean it up and make sure you have everything organized before you move. But most of us really never actually do that. But when we're moving our data, it's even more important. And when we're looking at moving our data to a new place, it's even more important that we're not just moving those problems to a place that's even farther away and that's harder to manage in a lot of ways. So what we recommend you do is that you get to understand your data before you start looking to move any of it at all. That you're going out there and you're looking for the PII, the social security numbers, the credit card numbers, the legal risk and the compliance risk, and make sure that that stuff's not really getting away from behind your firewall out into the cloud, or if it is going out there, that it's being done in a very secure fashion. And then looking for the data that you should move versus the data that's not worth moving. Are people still accessing that data? Is there data that's been accessed in the last 6 months? Is there data that hasn't been accessed in years? There might not be a compelling reason to put data that hasn't been used in 3 years up in the cloud, and really you're just adding expense to the organization to do so. So those are some of the top things that we like to recommend to our customers and clients.
So you mentioned legal risk, and I'm curious if you could provide some recommendations on best ways to mitigate legal risk with cloud-based applications.
Sure. I think the biggest one is just to look at your serial litigants. And you guys, I'm sure most people have a corporate disposition policy, although the majority of people aren't actually following it. But with your serial litigants, you know that their data is going to be reviewed time and time again. And so if you're looking at their data that's over 5 years old, over 7 years old, past its corporate disposition period, that's not only guaranteed cost to you because it's going to get reviewed time and time again, but it's also legal risk. And so, because you're going to turn that over to an opposing counsel, and you just know there's going to be a nugget of information somewhere that's going to turn into another lawsuit. But if it's past its corporate disposition period, it's time to clean that stuff up.
Bassam, a lot of organizations are big enterprises that are adopting cloud-based applications, and many of these large enterprises operate in multiple jurisdictions. So what guidance do you have for those organizations that have SaaS-based applications that may have data centers in multiple physical locations?
This is a very important question for large organizations that operate across multiple jurisdictions, because there are laws and regulations about where data can be stored. And it's very important to be aware of where that cloud service provider is going to store that information because of serious cross-border data transfer restrictions. So one of the first things that must be done is to get clear and committed information from the provider that the data will stay within the jurisdiction where it's supposed to be. So these are very important considerations, and probably this is one of the most important challenges that is facing large organizations as they move more and more applications and data to the cloud.
So Tom, moving to the cloud entails risk. So what focus would you recommend that organizations have from both a governance perspective and from a contractual perspective as they're considering cloud-based applications?
Well, I challenge the entire audience here. It's going to be really your responsibility to raise your hand early in these kinds of conversations about moving various applications, corporate data, your information assets to the cloud. You want to come across as supportive, but at the same time, you've got to raise your hand and say, what about these governance issues? How are we going to ensure that this information is secure? How are we going to ensure that we're not going to be impacted by someone else who might be in that same cloud should they find themselves involved in some litigation? What type of contractual things do we need to put into those contracts with our cloud providers to ensure that we're going to get that data back, that when we're being investigated or have to produce information for litigation, what their responsiveness is going to be to our requirements and expectations that the legal process is going to place on us. At the end of the day, remember, it's your data. It may be in the cloud. It may be managed by somebody else, but it's your data. You still have responsibility for it, so you need to make sure that you're protected and you're covered by contracts. The good news is the cloud providers recognize these things, and they're expecting you to ask for them. But there's only certain things that they're going to offer you in standard contracts. So you need to make sure that you have some of the basic GARP principles, if you will, that from a principle standpoint, you're covered. Your responsibility as the organization's information officer and custodian over all the corporate information is being adequately addressed.
So Tom mentioned the principles, and I'd actually like to turn to Galina to see to what extent that cloud computing intersects with the principles, and whether or not ARMA also has any additional guidance for enterprises considering cloud solutions.
Great, thank you, Brian. Actually, I was about to jump in and say that ARMA has a wonderful publication called, it's actually a guideline, and it's called Outsourcing Records to the Cloud. And that particular guideline walks through the different kinds of technologies that are available in the cloud and the various pluses and minuses to consider. Now, granted, it was written just about 2 years ago, but I think that the publication is fairly relevant and current still. At some point, it will require an update, of course, but right now I think it's very relevant. And what it really has that would be tremendously beneficial is a checklist for your contract. So it's got the legal considerations that you could consider. Now remember, you're not going to be able to get everything you want in a legal contract, depending on, of course, the size of your organization, the size of the contract, the provider you're dealing with. So you could take that checklist, which is quite comprehensive, and decide what's absolutely critical and when do you walk away if you don't have a particular consideration. So that's probably a very helpful thing. If you are considering cloud, go to the bookstore. It's available here. That's a plug for ARMA. Now, to your second part of the question, how do the principles apply? And of course, the principles are meant to be a framework for information governance anywhere. So whether it's cloud, whether it's mobile devices, whether it's on-premise data, the principles and pillars remain the same. There's really no difference. And I think it was Tom who said, it's your data, or maybe it was Bassam, but I think we all agree. It is your data, and you are responsible, and you certainly will hear that from the various sessions as well today. You are responsible for your data. And if your provider inadvertently discloses it and you lose private information, it's your responsibility. So you might have contractual recourse, but so the principles of privacy protection and, of course, accountability, right, are really, really important to apply. So walk through the maturity model, and you might even look at your provider through the lens of the maturity model and decide whether they are worthy of having your data. And now the other thing I'll just say is, as far as retention and disposition goes, most providers really are much better at storing your data forever than disposing of it, because cloud companies have generally been asked by many IT organizations to make sure everything is recoverable. And that's been the big focus. Now, from your perspective, you might not want that. You might want to see how things are dispositioned. You might also have accession responsibilities, meaning you might need to transfer data from your custody to somebody else's. So you need to really be very careful and clear. What does it mean to delete your data? Remember we said infrastructure in the cloud with this application in the cloud? Well, where is it? How do I know it's off all the backup systems? Has it been taken care of? What if you have to leave your provider, right? Those of you who have boxes in storage know you leave, let's say, vendor A to go to vendor B. You have some clauses. How do I get my boxes out? Well, how do you get your data out? Is that there? If not, right, are you going to be charged extra, or are they just going to say no? What if they go out of business? What's going to happen? Those are your principles of retention and disposition coming into play. So all of those principles apply, and some. And you really need to think that through as you evaluate your contracts. Now, does that mean I'm saying don't do it? You can't stop it. It's happening. People are going to go to the cloud. Just do it thoughtfully.
So in light of the recently issued Records Management Directive and also President Obama's Cloud First policies, are there special considerations that U.S. federal government agencies should adhere to when they're considering cloud-based applications? I'll just open that up to the panel.
Oh, well.
All right, go for it, Galina.
I'll go for it. Why not? I just spoke in, at the Department of Transportation 2 weeks ago on this particular subject to all of their records coordinators. So it was a really interesting question. So first of all, the memorandum. How many people are familiar with the Presidential Memorandum? Oh, of course, I hope the panelists. Great. Great. So the Presidential Memorandum is a directive for government records, and it does stress that records and information have to be managed for efficient government, and there's some very, very tight deadlines that the agencies have been given for implementation. National Archives is very actively involved and shepherding the agencies through this implementation. Now, the directive does not actually imply cloud. It does not dictate cloud, but there's a separate initiative for the government cloud. Now, make no mistake, government cloud is a private cloud at all times. There are no agencies that are considering, as far as I know, anything but a private cloud. Oftentimes, it's agency-wide private clouds for each agency. There's been some talk about infrastructure sharing across agencies, but I'll venture to predict that we won't see that very soon. But the directive is very, very clear. Basically, keep what you need, get rid of what you don't need, keep the right records, make yourselves more efficient. And it's very, very clear in the memorandum. There's a wonderful line there that says, the proper records management is the foundation of open government, which I think is quite telling as to how serious this is. So will we see cloud in the government? Definitely. I think we'll see private cloud. We'll see the movement to that. We'll see data going that way. We'll see more dispositioning of redundant, outdated, transitory content, or the rot, as we call it. We will definitely see the implementation. Oh, and the other interesting thing is that it says by 2019, they expect all records going to National Archives to be in electronic format. So fasten your seatbelts, as they say. It'd be an interesting ride.
So what about other vertical markets? If anyone would like to continue on that point, please do. But I'm also curious about what sorts of traction that you're seeing for cloud-based adoption in other vertical markets or other specific applications.
I mean, we're certainly seeing cloud adoption in various verticals, whether it is manufacturing or pharma or financial services. This is a transformational event in the computing industry. This is not a fad that will pass by. Everything is being transformed into at least a hybrid cloud and on-premises infrastructure. More and more we're seeing articles that are saying the CIO should report to the CFO in the future, that it's about managing those contracts and making sure that everything is done right. So we're definitely seeing a move, but again, the challenges are privacy and how do I make sure that my information is safe and I can get it back when I want to get it back.
I think you're seeing more applications, consistent applications being moved to the cloud than you're necessarily seeing large vertical industries. And also you're seeing a growth out there of community clouds. For example, electric utilities, collaborating together and putting various data for certain systems in the cloud together as a community. So those kinds of things are also being done out there.
Yeah, I was going to say that, as Polina mentioned earlier, it's not just moving data to the cloud in terms of storage. There's applications that are running in the cloud and things like Salesforce Chatter and Jive, SharePoint. People are using all of those as services in the cloud for their companies. And it's increasingly, it's not like email was where it's a fixed record. It's more of a conversation and a discussion that's happening up there. And so there's a lot of things people need to think about when they go after those data sources. It's not that I can just go get this one piece of information and then it's still there and it's exactly like it was 3 weeks later. There's been comments and discussions and ongoing conversation amongst your employees and collaboration amongst your employees. And with those things comes a very incremental nature of information governance and of discovery requests.
So we've talked a lot about different cloud-based applications, but we haven't talked about cloud-based records management, or specifically software as a service-based records management. So based on our survey findings, it's very clear that current adoption of cloud-based records management is very low. So the primary obstacles are the traditional ones, so concerns about security and privacy and legal issues. So kind of looking into your crystal balls, kind of seeing the rapid growth of cloud computing in many, many other application areas, including some related ones like SaaS-based message archiving. I'm kind of curious on the panel's insights into when they expect to see broader adoption of SaaS-based records management.
Anywhere you want to start?
Go for it, sure.
Okay. Well, I think there's another reason why we don't see the same kind of cloud adoption, and that is that much of the records and data that is the record of the association or organization is actually residing on premise. So it's not just subscribing to a records management application in the cloud. Then it's a question of how do you get your on-premise data, if you will, moved, declared, automatically declared, however you're going to do it. So does that imply you have to have an agent that plugs into your other systems? It's a hybrid model. How is that all going to work? There's a lot of other consideration. I think the privacy and security concerns are going to be less and less as the profession sees that cloud is in fact safe, secure, et cetera, as the contracts are clearer. I think also as National Archives moves its initiative forward, and oh, by the way, National Archives will have a industry peer group, including the industry, non-government industry, helping them and advising them, which I think will precipitate the adoption outside of the government. But I think what's going to really drive it is as data creation moves into the cloud. You will see records management moving more into the cloud to where the data sources are. And I think that, to me, is partially what's stopping the adoption.
Great, thanks. Other folks willing to offer their crystal ball insights? Some?
I think rather than cloud or not cloud, I think we're going to see more and more in-place records management. Content and information assets remaining where they are, staying where they are, whether they started their life in the cloud or started their life on premises, and being governed and managed as records while they remain where they are. So I think the net result will be that we will have records on the cloud, but not necessarily the cloud is not the objective. The cloud is to keep them where they are if you can, and then move them later based on business requirements.
So I think we're evolving into an industry that makes most of our decisions based upon our risk profile. We as a corporation, with regard to, does it make sense to manage information in place? Does it make sense to put it into a cloud? What's the value versus what's the risk and trade-off there? So, you know, you're seeing, and a lot of customers that I talk to, you're now seeing corporate risk now being involved in these discussions before, you know, not so much in you know, decision making, but with regard to what technology we're going to use, but when is the risk profile right for that particular company to make some of those kinds of decisions. So along with the compliance officer, corporate general counsel, chief records officer, CIO, and so forth, you're now seeing that new player, the corporate risk officer, also being a player in that decision-making process.
Thanks. You mentioned risk profiles. So let's shift gears a little bit and start talking about social media. So social media usage is obviously exploding, but is it really that different from email? Are there additional governance considerations that need to apply to social media that wouldn't necessarily apply to email? What do people need to watch out for here?
It really, you know, depends, first of all, what you mean by social media. I mean, within the enterprise, there's social collaboration tools. I think we're all aware of SharePoint, but there's also things that sit on top of SharePoint like NewsGator, which essentially turns SharePoint into a Facebook-type application. There's Salesforce Chatter, which could be considered a social media. There's Jive. There's a lot of considerations with just those alone that are relevant and different from what an email solution would be, where once again, people are talking, you know, they're not just document repositories anymore. There's wikis, there's blogs, there's user profiles. There's a lot of data out there that is just as susceptible to legal and compliance requests as, you know, old email and file shares were. And so that's one of the biggest things that I would tell people to think about, is that that's where their business is happening these days, and more, and I think we've all seen the explosive growth of SharePoint over the last 3 or 4 years. You know, that's where people are doing business, and that's what you need to be, you know, looking at from a corporate perspective.
Brian, you bring up a good point. You say, you know, is it any real difference than handling email? And in fact, the technology exists today in the minds of all of us up here. I believe that the technology exists today to be able to capture information that's being created in various social medias. The question is, as you appropriately pointed out, is the governance aspect of it. When and where in the process am I going to capture it? Where's it going to be managed? Whose responsibility is it going to be? And we need to do a better educational process with our end users who are using these social media tools. Are they going to be responsible for doing it? Are we going to put some automated method process in place to be able to capture that information? And they may be using some of these things for personal communications as well. So all those things need to be discussed and communicated, and it's a change aspect in our organization and a new way of looking at governance and involvement of our end users.
Let's drill down a bit deeper on that. So if either of you have any recommendations on the best ways to develop a social media governance program, I'd really love to hear some more about that.
No, I actually think that it's not necessarily cut and dry.
Okay.
Because it depends on what you're using social media for, and I think you did a great job of describing different uses. And so the governance and capture is going to be different. So I don't think you might develop a framework across the board, but you're going to look at the uses a little bit differently. So for example, a lot of companies, maybe a lot of your companies, are using LinkedIn for recruiting. And when you use LinkedIn for recruiting, and your HR department does, typically they don't collect the records of their recruiting process the same way that they normally do in other processes that they're used to. Now, obviously, they're obligated by law to do so. And the way you're going to put the framework in for that may be a little bit different than, let's say, your employees, and this is an interesting question, who are using Facebook and are talking about trade secrets and company secrets, or posting inappropriate information on their personal social media. And that's the social media use that's crossing over into the business world. And then the governance and compliance issues become very different. And your ability to enforce things becomes quite different as well as your legal rights. So when you look at social media, you really do need to examine, for policy purposes, the different cases in somewhat of a different light. It's not as simple as saying, well, here we just need to capture the record, but, well, what am I looking for, and when is it okay for me to look for that, right? And what kind of information am I privileged to discipline somebody for, and when is it freedom of speech? So there's a lot of other considerations that your legal department is going to weigh in on, and it's kind of being developed. I'll give you a plug for a session. There's a 10 a.m. session today on kind of some of these issues on the educational track. So any of you who are interested could certainly hear from Judge Hedges about it. But I think that there's a lot more to it because of what you were mentioning as the types of technologies. And again, to your point, Ryan, if you look at the principles, they're a great framework if you look through that lens at, again, the various uses. And I would again say various uses for your organization. You weigh the risk and reward and you say, well, if I really need to do this, the reward is great, I'll take the risk, I'll mitigate it, and I'll do it, right? And if the reward is not worth the risk, don't, right? Yeah. I could go on with other examples, but I won't.
Yeah, so what we see is it depends a lot on the industry that people are in. You know, if you're in a non-heavily regulated industry, typically those kind of public or even private profiles aren't discoverable, you know, through most legal channels unless it's more of a harassment request. And so once again, it goes back to that risk reward for actually monitoring those types of communications. For the majority of companies, the risk isn't all that high for a harassment type request, and you can deal with that in a more reactive manner once the court actually orders you to do so. But if you're in a highly regulated industry like, you know, banking or energy, where you might be putting trade secrets out there that can drastically affect a market, then you're going to be, you know, much more, I guess, hawkish in terms of going out there and watching those types of communications. That's where you want to have some sort of, you know, event-based filter that's going out there and logging what people are doing from behind your firewall up to Facebook, up to Twitter, to actually monitor those communications so that you can prove that there isn't any, you know, insider trading type of activity happening. So it really comes back to, you know, what industry are you in and looking at the risk reward for those industries.
Just a quick comment on the specific industries. So certainly FINRA's guidance on social media has big impact on financial services firms, but ultimately I expect that that guidance will have impact on a broader set of vertical markets as well. But Bassam, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think those issues that we're discussing here reminds me a lot of the discussions we had 10, 15 years ago about email. We faced very similar issues about what is appropriate to say in an email, in a private email, and using email with the corporate system and so on. And eventually, organizations ended up having systems to manage email as records, systems to apply surveillance over the email communications, etc. So I think we are going to see similar trends with the social media that will allow us as information governance professionals to make sure that we have an electronic and e-policy for social media in addition to our e-policy for emails, and then apply that policy to all these environments. It's just another new environment that we have to take care of.
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah, great.
If records managers haven't addressed social media yet in their organization, what's the best starting place for them? So they need to strike the right balancing act between being Dr. No and saying absolutely no social media, because there's the risk that people could work around them. But you also need to give the right guidance. So how should they get started?
A lot of it is internal discussions with the appropriate authorities in the organization, back to corporate general counsel, corporate compliance officer, corporate risk officer, having some of those internal discussions before you make some of those leaps and make some of those decisions. The important thing is you've got all the wisdom of anybody that helps determine value and risk in your organization to weigh in on those kinds of things, and make sure you have a good level set across the organization with regard to governance of it. As we've all agreed, the technology is there to be able to do it. It's just a matter of how are you going to, in your own company, legislate, if you will, the use of social media and the capture and management of it as a business asset.
I think there is a moment within these processes where you get to the point where you have a corporate mandate to do something about the problem. Until that point, you are just one of several advocates, perhaps, who are lobbying within the organization and making the organization aware of the need and the risk issues related to social media or anything else. So it's very important to understand that it's very difficult to move forward until you get to that point of, yes, I have a corporate mandate, there is a senior sponsor, and that senior sponsor is going to back me up in whatever program or addition to the existing programs that I want to undergo.
So,
Galina, would you like to add to that?
yeah, I'd actually like to take maybe a slightly different perspective to that. So first I want to focus on something you said.
Okay.
And you used the term Dr. No, and it really actually bothers me. And I would like to throw out advice to everybody in the room, and that is, don't say no right away. I know that's the natural tendency, but don't. You'll be listened to much more if you don't do that. So that next year when Brian comes back, you say, oh, I can't say that about records managers anymore. So I think it's really important that you try to say yes as much as possible, because the organizations are going to do it anyway. So if you are to be an influencer and you want to actually affect positive change and do things thoughtfully, you want to say yes, but let's consider all the issues and mitigate our risks. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, how would you start, to your point? I think in general, if you put a good framework and working relationship together, then anytime any new technology is introduced, there should be a discussion to which you're invited that says, okay, let's weigh our pros and cons and how do we do it? And that would be the ideal state. Before you get to that ideal state, pick a project, pick something visible that you know your organization A needs and B is worried about. So to your point, if you're financial services and you have people tweeting advice and you want to capture those feeds, and you have to because it's regulated, insert yourself into that process and say, okay, let me help you govern it properly. Let me help you say yes. And we could do our business, but we'll govern it. Or go to your HR department and say, I know you're doing your recruiting through LinkedIn. Let me help you capture the right information. And when you do that and you get your sort of first couple of successful wins, you will be asked more and more. So that would be my approach to that.
Great. So let's shift gears. So I know that all the panelists have either tablets or smartphones, and I'm curious as to what guidance that the panel would have for the folks here in the audience about how they should address mobile devices from a records management perspective. What do they need to be? What do folks need to be aware of? And again, where's the best place to start?
Go ahead. Well, once again, it comes down to when and where and how in the process of using those devices are we going to capture those information assets? And is it going to be an automated classification process? So is everything coming in and going out of that device, created on that device, going to be analyzed behind the firewall to determine its business applicability and value to the organization and retention policy? Or are you going to rely upon the end user to make those kinds of decisions and push that information to the appropriate repository and classification scheme. So once again, it requires some thought, what's going to work best in the culture of our organization, the way our people do business, and what can we best rely upon. So it comes back to the same principles we've been talking about this morning.
I think the biggest problem is that in a lot of cases, the people, you don't have a choice, right? I mean, those devices are out there and people are creating data on them, and it's not as easy to capture as it would be behind the firewall. Obviously, there's certain applications like email which can continue to be captured much like it is today. But there's other applications on there where you're either just creating local information or you're creating personal information or going up to websites, et cetera. And that kind of data isn't as readily capturable. And then it also depends on what type of device you're on. If you're on an Android-style device, typically you can just, if there's a legal request for that data, you can go plug that in and treat it as a USB device and go index and capture whatever you needed to do. If you're on an iOS or Apple device, it's a lot harder process. There's really no way to mount that. And really, I think the advent of iCloud is the first way that people have found to actually go out there and capture data from those devices, because Apple doesn't let you put any application into their store. And they definitely don't let you put an application up there that allows you to capture data from the phone, because that would violate their terms of services. So unless you're a big enough corporation to go license the entire App Store, which some people have actually done, you can't put the applications up there that you need to go do it. And so really your only recourse is a forensic collection from iCloud, and it's in a reactive nature. So there's a lot of things that you need to think about.
So other than reactive responses like that, are there other proactive steps that others might recommend?
I think those portable devices eventually are going to become enterprise ready. At this stage, they are not enterprise ready.
Yeah.
They lack the capabilities that we have in our laptops so that IT can control what data is stored on them. So I think as we progress on the path of BYOD and so on, we are going to have more and more devices that are enterprise ready. But underlying all of this is the challenge of dealing with privacy as well, because this is a personal device and you're keeping on that personal device personal data. So where do you draw the line? This is going to be a challenge. And there will be...
You cited a great example this morning, a major corporation out there, having a
switching
specific policy.
Siri. Switching off Siri. Yeah. Because literally Siri is reading the email, sending the text of the email to Apple, and Apple is sending back the audio to play it. So that corporation felt that its IP is now being sent to Apple. So a precondition of using an iPhone within that corporation is that you have to give it to IT, and IT switches off Siri. So this is starting to happen.
So you're asking about proactive steps.
Yes.
And there are definitely some proactive steps you could be taking even today, because obviously this is going to keep happening. And by the way, the devices may or may not, in your case, you just described a corporate phone and device, or you have your personal phone receiving corporate information, or your iPad being used to create corporate information. And oh, by the way, if you're putting it into the iCloud, you are putting your information in the cloud, and what are the terms of service for iCloud and retention practices. So you have to think through that too. So there are proactive things. For one thing, there could be policies that you could draft. That's proactive. And how do you want to treat it? People are going to bring their own devices. So for instance, you want to be potentially very clear that if there is a corporate discovery request, their personal information notwithstanding, if they're going to use it, you're going to actually take their device. And you're going to do that. And that could be proactively written in so people know what to expect. You might also consider, for example, what happens to documents. So on the iPad, I think it's still the case, certainly used to be, that if you got rid of certain applications, like let's say your note application, you would actually get rid of all the data that came with it. So data wasn't separate like in Word. So you might want to be really clear to people that if they remove an app, or you might want to prevent the removal of an app because it's going to remove the data that goes with that app. So there again, to the point that was made, if you look at the principles and you sit down and you say, before we start doing this, let's look at it through the same lens. and put some of these policies in place and maybe not allow certain things, but you're going to have to allow most communication. And I think the most important thing is make sure your security people actually get involved. So security and privacy and loss of device is one of the biggest challenges. If I lost my device, can everybody read my corporate data? Can everybody get the private files? And that's something you could also proactively do today because the technology certainly is available to take care of that. So there are some things you could do proactively even today.
Great. So we're going to be taking questions that are being sent via social media very shortly. But before we get to those, I'd like to ask each of the panelists in just 1 minute and not more than 1 minute, what high-level guidance that they would recommend for organizations as they contend with social media, cloud computing, and mobile. Galina, do you want to start?
Sure. I would certainly recommend that you get as involved as possible in all the decision making. Try to say yes, not no, and yes in a thoughtful way. Analyze things consistently and show value. Technology is going to move forward. Today it's social media and cloud. Tomorrow it'll be something else that we can't even think of yet. And as it moves forward, if you establish the framework and the trust, and you bring in the right people, the right technology, the right guidance, you'll end up with the best possible results going forward.
Sam?
I think it's very important to look at cloud and personal devices and so on as part of a wide range of environments that you need to apply governance to. So don't look at the problem in a vertical way, look at it in a horizontal way. You need to apply your existing information governance program to this increasing range of devices and environments, whether it is cloud, bring your own device, and so on and so forth. So it's very important not to create a new silo in the organization, because that's simply is going to increase the complexity and the challenges in your task. So you have a good foundation in your records management program, in your information governance program. Use that and extend the range of that program to cover these devices.
Interject yourself into the process. Make sure you have the right players in the room with you for those decision-making questions, and rely upon your principles, the ones you have that you rely upon for your existing records management program. Rely upon them as you're making those tough decisions, and follow your gut and your experience, and talk to your peers.
So I'd say two main things. The first is that as we start this move to the cloud, we're not going to just jump there right away. So we're going to be living in a hybrid world for quite a while, for the foreseeable future, really. And so the biggest piece of advice I give is to embrace a more distributed architecture in terms of being able to go out there and understand your data. Rather than looking at one silo of data here and one silo of data there, you really want to be able to look at your data across a single pane of glass, whether it's behind the firewall or out in the cloud, and be able to apply policies and information governance in unison across both of those types of environments. The second thing I'd say is that, in slight disagreement with some of the panelists here, I don't think that the social collaboration platforms are just like email. They are just like email in that the policies you need to apply to them, but they're not in the nature of how that data gets created. Once you create an email, it's really a fixed asset, and it's there and it's done. With these social collaboration platforms, people can edit them whenever they want to. They can go update them. They can go add comments to them. So if you're just trying to do a one-time collection, it might work. But if you're doing incremental collections, or if you're going out there and trying to incrementally collect records, you need to not keep on grabbing this bigger and bigger object time and time again, and just making your data problem worse and worse. You want to be more incremental and more surgical in what you can do with that type of data.
Sure.
Great. So we do have our first question that's come in via Twitter. So still talking just managing only records. And what about the other 75%? I think that's an excellent question. I speak with so many different enterprises, and most of them are managing just a very small set of electronic content within their organizations. So what about the bulk of the data?
Well, I didn't realize we were talking just about records. I actually thought we were talking about all information. Yep. And I thought we made that point.
Yeah,
it's all information assets. And we actually said, well, you delete things, doesn't mean you disposition just your records. You delete information that's transitory in nature, certainly absent duty to preserve within your normal course of business. You want to get rid of those assets that you no longer need. And so these governance principles don't just apply to records at all. They actually apply to all enterprise information. And by the way, structured and unstructured. So we certainly talked a lot about unstructured data and communication. We didn't touch on databases and structured data. And we won't because we don't have time, but certainly the governance has to be consistent across all of that, and not all of it is a record.
Absolutely, it's about information assets. It's not limited to records. And by the way, when you talk about information assets, your volume has suddenly grown by probably tenfold because a small percentage of your records of your information assets are records. So beware of the volume.
I'd say, I mean, the latest numbers I've seen are that only about 5% of an organization's data are actually records. About 1% is subject to legal hold at any given time. So you're actually, if you're talking about just records and just legal, you're talking about a very small percentage of your data. And I think what all of us have been talking about up here has been to managing your data holistically. By understanding all of your data and understanding it where it lives, now you can start to only look at copying or putting on retention that 5%. And once you know that 5%, now you can start being more aggressive about cleaning up the rest of it and getting rid of stuff that really isn't of any value to your organization.
So we have another question. As a records manager, how much technology do I need to understand about the cloud?
I think you don't have to be immediately become a technology professional with regard to the cloud in order to do your job as the information records officer of your organization. Take advantage of things like some of NIST publications on it, take advantage of ARMA publications and AIM and things like that, things that are written for an audience like yourself, and educate yourself on those things. But I don't think you have to be a technology person. That's not what your role in the organization is. Your role in the organization is to ask the tough questions and make sure that there's appropriate governance in place over the information assets of the organization.
I'd say, you definitely don't need to be a technology person, but you need to understand the implications of the technology. Absolutely. You don't need to know the details. Yep. And here's another plug for ARMA. They're excellent guidelines, white papers. Take a look at them. You'll know enough to ask the right questions, because that's really at the end of the day what it's about. Yep. You just need you can't not know about it, but you don't need to know the details. Nobody's going to ask you to implement the infrastructure, I don't think. But they will ask you to say, well, why would I need this in a contract? And you should know those kinds of answers. Again, you're not a lawyer. The lawyer will figure it out, but you'll say, have you thought A, B, and C, because I understand how this functions.
Yeah. I don't think you need to be a technology expert by any stretch of the imagination, but really what you need to know is, okay, I've got my information governance practice that I do for my data behind the firewall, or maybe I have the one that I want to do for the data behind my firewall. How does that extend out to the cloud? And can I make sure that my cloud service provider and my technology that I'm using behind my firewall can extend to the cloud services? And I think once I have those answers, then I'm a lot more comfortable in making the move, and I don't need to understand a depth of technology, under the covers that makes the cloud work, so to speak.
And know enough about it to participate in these important conversations that will take place in the organization about decisions. What application do I move to the cloud? An organization doesn't decide to move everything to the cloud, so it will be application by application, class of information by class of information. So know enough to be able to participate in those conversations and provide the important feedback that you have.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So the question is BYOD at work. Will this be the way the next generation works?
Without a doubt.
Undoubtedly.
I'm in discussions with clients all the time about this, on the show floor, face-to-face and things like that. That is the generation that's going to be the workforce out there, and they want to bring their own device to work. They want to be social. They collaborate all the time in decision-making processes. So, yeah, we have to be prepared for it. We have to understand the issues and the challenges and the rewards and the risks in order to make responsible decisions. Do I need to turn off Siri if I'm going to use it, if I'm a competitor of Apple? If I'm not, maybe I don't care. But those kinds of things need to be looked at and thoroughly understood by the corporation.
Yeah, undoubtedly we're moving away from desktop. And actually we have moved away from desktop into mobility and tablets. And undoubtedly, I don't even think it's going to take a generation. I think in about 5 years or less, we'll all be working that way. We're kind of moving that way. So yeah, take a look at what's available, publications, white papers, keep reading about it, so you can be inserted into that discussion immediately.
I don't think it's going to be the next generation or even maybe the next 5 years. I think that we're already there.
5 years
I mean, I do 30% of my work from my own cell phone, and I think the majority of people within my company they bring their iPads to meetings and they do the majority of stuff there, and that's not something that the company issued to them. That's something that they brought in themselves. And as I meet with other companies, I see people sitting around tables with iPads taking notes, and I guarantee those aren't corporate issued iPads. So I think we're there today, and I think that, as Bassam mentioned earlier, there is some catching up to do from the device perspective and being able to be corporate or enterprise ready. But I think we need to work at making those a priority for those companies that are putting out those devices, that we embrace the ones that give us the tools we need to be able to manage them.
Yeah, but bottom line, there are two fundamental issues. One of them is those devices need to become more enterprise ready. And second, organizations need to figure out what to do with the privacy issue. How do you address the privacy issue? I think that will, but it cannot be stopped.
No.
We are there.
Embrace it, make it work.
Just like
Make
social
sure you're
media.
covered.
Just like social media and cloud. It's here. You just have to accept it. You're not going to stop it.
So I've got one final question. So our survey shows that records managers don't have a lot of controls today over social media, cloud computing, and mobile devices. We've talked about how these technologies are rapidly surging. So many different companies that we work with all the time. What do you see among those early adopters as characteristics that are making them successful with their current control efforts over these technologies?
I think two things. One is we are a European company and we see differences in Europe from the way things are done in North America. In Europe, people responsible for records management are more IT savvy. And I think that is a quality that is important to acquire, to become IT savvy. Not a technologist necessarily, but to be able to participate effectively in technical meetings where these important subjects are being discussed and provide a good, valuable opinion. So that's the first thing. The second is how sensitive is IT to information management. And the I in CIO doesn't represent infrastructure. It should also represent information. And it's when you have those two elements within the organization, there's a much higher chance of success in these environments, whether it's cloud, bring your own device, etc.
You asked what do the early adapters do well, I think.
What they're doing well, or what characteristics are common for those?
For the early adopters who are successful. I think the really successful early adopters have thought through some of the issues and put controls in place that are, number one, in regulatory or legal or business compliance, but number two, are reasonable such that people, A, can follow them, and B, won't go around them. Because again, you could put any kind of controls in place, but if they're ridiculous, people will find a way around them. And so the early adopters have put in controls that allow people to do their jobs and then also give the sufficient risk mitigation and appropriate controls to the organization. And I think that's key. If your controls are such that it's not that, people will go around it. So for example, my favorite is mailbox size, although it's not from this particular example. How many of you have emailed stuff to your private accounts or put them on, I forget PST files, but on thumb drives and lost them, or who knows, because you know what, the policy is ridiculous, doesn't do anything, right? It's there, but it's not a real control. So don't put those in, and then you have much more success.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we've seen that has made records managers successful is when they've worked closely with the legal teams, worked closely with the IT organizations to really make them understand or make them aware of how proper records management helps the entire organization, and how categorizing records makes the legal process that much faster and that much more efficient. How figuring out what data is important to the organization can make IT more efficient by figuring out not only what's important but what's not important to the organization anymore, and having those people at the same table when you're discussing both technology as well as process from a business perspective.
Great. So I think that we're just about out of time now, and I believe that there's one step left here for the team.
Marilyn's in wing.
Marilyn, are we ready?
Welcome to the stage, Marilyn Beer, the CEO of ARMA International. It is time for door prizes.
This was really excellent. I have to tell you that I sat here and thought, my goodness, this group of people really is grappling with some heavy issues. And I really appreciated, from a personal perspective, all the practical tips. So thank you very much. Let's give them another round of applause.